have low vision or have another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Evelyn, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the December 28th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. It's the Lives They Lived issue, which reviews the lives of some of the people that we lost this year. Jane Goodall, born 1934. In the beginning, Jane Goodall named the chimpanzees. This was controversial. It was 1960, back when scientists weren't supposed to dignify the animals they studied with names. They were supposed to use numbers to remain objective, to avoid anthropomorphism at all costs. This is still largely the case, but Goodall wasn't that kind of scientist. Technically, she wasn't a scientist at all. She was 26, and her only degree was a certificate from secretarial school. In fact, it was partly this inexperience that inspired Goodall's employer, the paleoanthropologist Louis Leakey, to send her off to study the wild chimps of Tanzania. Fresh eyes and a novel approach might finally penetrate the mysterious world of humanity's closest non-human relatives. This turned out to be true. Day after day, from dawn to dusk, Goodall stalked the forests, often barefoot, trying to establish rapport with the chimps. She waited, quietly filling notebooks, hoping that the creatures would come to accept this strange white ape. For months, they mostly avoided her. Finally, mutual curiosity won out. The chimps came closer and closer, eventually all the way into Goodall's camp. She fed them bananas, groomed them, and was groomed in return, celebrated their births, cried over their deaths, and as she got to know them, she gave them names: David Greybeard, Mr. McGregor, Lord Dracula, Flo, Melissa. As the decades passed, as Goodall established herself as the world's leading chimpanzee expert, the roster of names grew: Beethoven, Freud, Groucho, Midge, and on and on. It occurred to me, reading the remembrances of her life, that Jane Goodall itself sounds like a made-up name. It's like John Nice Guy, the name of a saint or of a cartoon character fighting to save the world. It sounds like a name a chimpanzee might make up to describe the first who really took them seriously. But it actually was her name, or at least part of it. She was born Valerie Jane Morris Goodall to a middle-class family in England. As a child, she was outdoorsy, adventurous, and obsessed with animals. She once coaxed a bird to nest in her bookshelves. Her mother encouraged these enthusiasms. Her father was mostly absent. At night, Goodall often dreamed that she was a man, doing things that only men were allowed to do, which often meant traveling to Africa, like the heroes in her favorite storybooks. As soon as she could, after saving up money from waitressing and secretary jobs, Goodall got herself there. And her path was set. For the rest of her life, 65 years, she documented and advocated on behalf of the chimps. In middle age, when Goodall could no longer live in the bush, she traveled the world relentlessly, some 300 days a year, as an educator and environmental activist. When she died at age 91, she was in the middle of a speaking tour. Just as Jane Goodall was her real name, but not quite all of it, Jane Goodall was a real person, but also an invention, a media sensation created largely by the National Geographic Society, which funded her research. One curiosity of Goodall's career is that her earth-shaking scientific discoveries that chimpanzees eat meat and make and use tools all came from her first stint in Tanzania, before the cameras arrived. The wide world still had no idea what Goodall looked like, and she would have been happy to keep it that way. But National Geographic sensed a visual goldmine. This photogenic blonde woman in khaki shorts, face to face with Africa's primordial great apes. They insisted on sending a photographer along with a checklist of poses. Jane looking through binoculars, Jane laughing, Jane cooking, Jane washing her hair in a stream. Goodall resented this, but she agreed to play along. She understood that in the same way that a chimp could use a blade of grass to fish termites out of a nest, she could use fame to advance her larger projects, studying and protecting the chimps. Certainly, I understand that it is necessary to build up a story around Jane Goodall, she conceded in an early letter. The resulting books and articles and photos and films made her an international celebrity. A 1965 documentary, Miss Goodall and the Wild Chimpanzees, drew an estimated 25 million viewers on CBS. The photographer and videographer, the Dutchman Hugo van Lawick, would become Goodall's first husband and the father of her only child, a son who grew up partly in the bush, playing inside a cage so the chimpanzees wouldn't hurt him. Goodall eventually got a PhD from Cambridge, another tool, one that would make the scientific community take her more seriously. But she continued to bring her whole self to the work. As a performer, Goodall was sly and charismatic. She delighted human crowds by demonstrating her mastery of chimp language, an elaborate dialect of pant hoots, foot grunts, wah barks, and SOS screams. Look for the clip of her insulting John Oliver, chimp style, before eating a banana sideways. In Goodall's books, chimpanzee society is as convoluted as anything in Jane Austen. There is infinite drama, jealousy, alliances, schisms, betrayals. Goodall's chimps tickle each other, get colds, feast on delicacies, termites, army ants, and tease baboons by shaking wet branches over their heads. They appear to dance in the rain, mourn their dead, and sometimes die of grief. She presents them as distinct, reasoning-worthy individuals. David Greybeard had the most beautiful eyes of them all, large and lustrous, set wide apart, she writes in her book. Through a window, they somehow expressed his whole personality, his serene self-assurance, his inherent dignity, and from time to time, his utter determination to get his way. But chimps can also be shockingly violent. Once, Goodall wrote, a male named Frodo stomped on her head so hard that it almost broke her neck. She describes males competing in apparent dominance, displays scowling, hair bristling, sprinting around, and dragging branches on the ground. She documents chimps killing baby monkeys with a bite to the skull. She once chronicled a coordinated campaign of intra-chimp extermination that resembled organized human warfare. Still, Goodall never lost her admiration and devotion. She and the chimpanzees were a perfect match. They were both in-between figures. Goodall was a human living among non-humans, a media-savvy scientist, a woman in a misogynistic world. Comely Miss spends her time eyeing apes, an early headline read, and chimpanzees, as Goodall put it, blurred the line between humans and animals. Most of our genetic code is nearly 99% identical to chimps. They are more closely related to us than they are to gorillas. Chimps can sort objects, learn sign language, and recognize their own reflection. To a species as narcissistic as humans, this presents a serious identity crisis. Chimpanzees are a funhouse mirror, both us and not us, familiar yet alien, fascinating but terrifying. One of Goodall's greatest virtues was that she refused to approach this relationship from a position of superiority or fear. She engaged the chimpanzees as much as humanly possible on their own terms. For a long time, I never liked to look a chimpanzee straight in the eye, she wrote. I assumed that as is the case with most primates, this would be interpreted as a threat or at least a breach of good manners. Not so. As long as one looks with gentleness, without arrogance, a chimpanzee will understand and may even return the look. George Foreman, born 1949. Before the hamburger grills and the ABC sitcom George that lasted 9 episodes and the boisterous appearances on Late Night with Dave Letterman and the monthly 30-second sermons for Esquire magazine, before it became impossible to picture him without that big teddy bear smile, George Foreman was, in his own words, the kind of man it was easy to root against. To use more of his own words, he concocted reasons for cold-cocking someone, and he couldn't stop, because it was the one thing I did well. According to the legend of the boxing match billed as the Rumble in the Jungle, Foreman's epic heavyweight title defense against Muhammad Ali in Kinshasa, Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, which began at about 4 a.m. local time on October 30th, 1974, so that it could air in prime time back in America, Foreman is the villain of the story. He is terse, glowering, a pitiless 25-year-old punching machine with Samson's arms and nuclearology in his fists, as Norman Mailer put it. The two fighters would split a record-setting $10.45 million purse, but Mailer, who would later write a book about the fight, feared that the aging Ali, then 32, wouldn't survive to collect any of that money. But 9 days before the bout, Foreman was hit above his right eye during a sparring session, opening up a cut that forced the fight to be delayed 6 weeks. He was never able to get comfortable in Zaire. He hated the food and the bugs, the stairs wherever he went, and he rarely left his hotel except to train. Ali jogged through villages with local kids and charmed the continent. On the night of the fight, he entered the ring in the Stade Tata Raphael to a chorus of 60,000 spectators, chanting Ali Beaumaye, Ali Beaumaye, Ali kill him. Back home in the parts of Black America where the two fighters were raised, Foreman in Houston, Ali in Louisville, Ali was a civil rights hero who had forfeited his heavyweight title over his refusal to serve in Vietnam, and then fought his criminal conviction all the way to the Supreme Court. Foreman had won a gold medal in boxing for the U.S. at the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City, but even some of his kin were mortified by his prancing around the ring with a tiny American flag at the same games where John Carlos and Tomac Smith raised their fists. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the December 28th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Foreman's gradual transfiguration from global villain to beloved pitchman is one of the great reverse heel turns in all of sports, and it began that morning in Kinshasa. In the fourth round, Foreman wobbled Ali and moved in for the kill, only to hesitate because he spotted one of his closest friends in the crowd, a man I'd consider family, booing and rooting against him. That sight is, in fact, the image I recall most vividly from the fight, Foreman later wrote in his 1995 memoir By George. In a state of shock, I couldn't deliver the punch that probably would have ended the fight. 4 rounds later, Ali ended it instead. Foreman had thrown so many punches he could barely lift his arms. He had exhausted all his nuclear. Diane Keaton, born 1946. When Diane Keaton was nearly 50 years old, she found herself on a bumpy flight home from Cannes, terrified. She hated flying, and turbulence sent her into a panic. The film she was promoting had been a modest critical success, a relief after many years of middling reviews. But as she surveyed her life, she felt lonely. She missed her grouchy dog. How could it be this was the only creature she longed for? And where was the loving partner who could hold her hand at the moment of fear? When she finally got home, she steadied herself by writing in her journal, a long habit she had learned from her mother, who meticulously documented her thoughts for 40 years. Keaton wondered how she had ended up here and whether she needed to take more risks in her life, especially those revolving around intimacy, she wrote in her memoir. Then again, I know I have to make a decision that will or will not lead to the experience of a different kind of love. A love of less expectations on the receiving end, she wrote, speaking of her own disappointments. It was then that she decided to adopt a baby. Becoming a mother at age 50 to her daughter, Dexter, and again at 55 when she adopted her son, Duke, quelled her unease. Motherhood seemed to come easily to her. She is embracing, fun, totally engaged. She saved nearly everything her children created, drawings, cards, scraps of projects, and also the letters she wrote to them every so often, several of which she included in Then Again. Attempts to cross the barriers of our 50-year age gap, sort of explanations and apologies pertaining to who I am. She was aware of the unconventionality of her choice to start a family as a single older woman, and was open with her kids about the emotional challenges that adoption might involve. Being adopted is to start life with loss, she wrote in a letter to Duke. It was necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Loss helps us learn how to handle goodbyes. Starting out knowing something others will have to learn, she went on, has its advantages. You will already have the tools to make you more open to the many varieties of love. This introspection and emotional transparency were typical of Keaton. They were the wellspring of her acting as well as her mothering. Keaton always credited her first New York acting teacher, Sandy Meisner, with her unpretentious, lucid style. When she arrived in the city at 19, the beloved eldest daughter in a family of 4 siblings who were raised in California. She desperately wanted to succeed, but she worried she wasn't beautiful enough. She hadn't yet taken possession of her expressive face or her offhand elegance. She soon fell in with a group of eccentric artists and met Woody Allen, whom she dated for a few years. He cast her in her breakout role at age 31 as Annie Hall. The character is based on Keaton and her indelible wardrobe. Trench coats, fetching ties, and bowler hats was pulled from Keaton's own closet. Annie revealed to the world Keaton's essence, a conspiring warmth overlaid with a jangling neurotic charm. In short order, Keaton became a major star, playing a variety of complex roles. Teresa Dunn in Looking for Mr. Goodbar, and Louise Bryant in Reds, and having love affairs with Warren Beatty and Al Pacino. She admired these men all her life, writing sharp portraits of them in her memoirs, but she seemed to blame herself for failing to settle into a long-term partnership. This is a leitmotif in Keaton's writing, a sense that she was inept at intimacy and needed to fix herself until the moment she became a mother. Despite her huge early success, there was a stretch of years in the late 80s and early 90s when many of the films she was in did poorly. She described to a friend having to essentially beg for roles, but her insecurities lived alongside a sturdy trust in her own artistic impulses. She was a collector of California Monterey furniture, Bauer pottery, houses that she would exquisitively renovate and sell. She edited books of photographs, California Spanish architecture, tabloid photos, and old Hollywood promotional images, to name a few, and kept reams of journals, spending decades in psychoanalysis, laying herself bare. When her mother got sick with Alzheimer's disease, Keaton documented her decline, even lovingly transcribing confused voicemail messages. After her mother died, Keaton wrote Then Again, the richest of her 3 memoirs, in which she layered her mother's account of her life in her journal, anguished, determined, beautifully composed with her own. It's a relentlessly self-inspecting double portrait in which Keaton reckons with having lived the varied freewheeling life her mother never got to. As her mother's mind was fading, Keaton was immersed in the clamor of motherhood, driving Dexter to swim practice, roughhousing with Duke. Her deepest desire, she wrote, was to give her children what her mother had given her, the freedom to become themselves. I believe people evolve into who they want to be, she wrote to Dexter in a letter. In a way, you create who you are. Amid all the change in her life, Keaton's career revived. She had transformed herself from the elusive, uncertain woman of her early films into a stately one whose comedy was bolstered by worldliness. In Father of the Bride, The First Wives Club, and her favorite film, Something's Gotta Give, she plays women of a certain age, firmly planted in their lives with wisdom and mirth to spare. But she never lost that quiver of sensitivity, her ready access to emotional truth. Oh my God. In Something's Gotta Give, Keaton plays Erica Berry, a lauded playwright who has forsworn romance. Jack Nicholson is Harry Sanborn, a notorious cad who dates only women under 30. Unexpectedly thrown together in a summer house, they find themselves submitting to a surprising passion. After they first have sex, Harry clams up, getting up from bed and declaring that he prefers to sleep alone. "I'm an old dog," he tells her. In response, Keaton delivers a performance that in the span of 90 seconds lets us in on a whole history of emotional defense and disarmament. Her face, more radiant than ever, opens and closes like a fan, revealing all the nakedness and yearning that new love can still summon. And then the desolation it can bring, the gathering of courage it requires. Moved by her, Harry eventually comes back to bed. This capacity to ask for and receive love may be this accomplished woman's biggest accomplishment. Erica's self-possession is Keaton's. She was a woman whose unyielding singularity, her urge to really know herself, gave her access to her deepest feelings, and eventually to the boundless giving self she had always wanted to be. Clint Hill, born 1932. The Secret Service agent was haunted by JFK's death and his failure to prevent it, by Matt Flegenheimer. For nearly all his life, Clint Hill discussed the events of November 22, 1963, the situation in Dallas. He called it exactly twice, in 1964 with the Warren Commission and in 1975 with Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes. He did not talk about that day with friends or medical professionals or his wife at the time. He did not talk about it with fellow Secret Service agents to whom he had flashed a desperate thumbs down from the president's car. He did not talk about it with Jacqueline Kennedy, whose life he probably saved in Dallas, or with Robert F. Kennedy, whom Hill had informed by phone from Parkland Memorial Hospital, "It's as bad as it can get." The Attorney General hung up. By then, Hill's Friday afternoon chronicled in due course across feature film, amateur film, good television, bad television, oral history, federal inquiry, pre-internet fever swamp, internet fever swamp, podcast era fever swamp, was already doomed to shadow his next 6 decades. Hill, then 31, had been assigned to protect the First Lady. He was riding through Dealey Plaza on the running board of the follow-up car when he heard an explosive noise from his right. He saw President John F. Kennedy grabbing at his throat and sagging to his left. Sprinting from his vehicle to the Kennedys, Hill grasped a trunk handle and yanked himself aboard. The man in the business suit, almost superheroic in the Zapruder footage, racing into history, but too late to reverse it. Mrs. Kennedy, in her pink suit and pillbox hat, had climbed onto the limousine's rear, reflexively collecting the material. Hill said later that had escaped the president's head. Hill pushed her back into her seat. If he hadn't, according to commission testimony, she most likely would have fallen to the roadway in the motorcade's path. Hill threw his body over the president and First Lady, gripping the door frame to elevate himself into the line of anything else coming. He could see a hole in the president's head. skull. Roughly 6 seconds had passed between the first shot and the fatal third shot, Hill noted afterward. He would forever believe he might have been able to save Kennedy with half a second more. "It was my fault," he told Wallace 12 years later, sitting next to his wife and fighting tears while clawing at a cigarette. "No one has ever suggested that for an instant," Wallace said accurately. "If I had reacted just a little bit quicker, and I could have, I guess," Hill insisted, "and I'll live with that to my grave." He looked like a man who would keep his word. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the December 28th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Until his death last February at 93, Hill was consigned to a life spent revisiting the best view of the worst thing, the best chance to have no real chance to save the president. He had attempted suicide 37 days after Dallas. He shared in 2022, walking fully clothed onto the ocean of Palm Beach, Florida, where he was accompanying Mrs. Kennedy and her children. A police officer rescued him. Instead, Hill lived long enough to shudder through future executive assassination attempts, from Gerald Ford to Donald Trump, a reel of fresh and harrowing Kennedy family tragedies, an entwined escalation of political hostilities and tinfoil-hatted plots to rationalize them, for which November 22nd remains an American UR text, a procession of lone gunman mass shooters who reminded Hill of Lee Harvey Oswald. He winced at every grassy knolled yarn about phantom accomplices and magic bullets, affirming the non-magic of the mainstream Dallas account, not because he was an apologist or a lackey, but because no one has ever remembered and re-examined more about 6 seconds of their workday in the history of employment. Hill left the Secret Service in 1975, but had never wanted to retire from the greatest job he'd known, the one that had turned a former North Dakota orphan into code name Dazzle, delivering him to Brazil with Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Australia with Lyndon B. Johnson, and Greece with Mrs. Kennedy, where her husband had instructed Hill not to let her near Aristotle Onassis. No, Hill was retired by medical dictate after failing a physical with what nobody yet called severe PTSD. He spent much of the next decade self-medicating in his basement. He developed a habit of walking around Washington with his head down, lest anyone recognize him as the agent who couldn't quite get there. In 1990, Hill decided to visit Oswald's sixth-floor perch at the Texas School Book Depository building. He signed in under a pseudonym. He interrogated every angle. He concluded that he'd never had a true chance after all, though he would revert to sporadic self-flagellation in perpetuity. In his later years, at the urging of Lisa McCubbin Hill, an author who became his second wife, Hill started talking and writing about Dallas, what he saw, what he did, what it did to him, in books, on television, and at public events. It was cathartic, he found. He could talk about other things, too, his efforts to bring women into the Secret Service, his frustration with Mary Kennedy conspiracists like Oliver Stone and Donald Trump, who in 2016 pushed a lie tying Ted Cruz's father to Oswald. By 2017, when the government released a long-awaited trove of Kennedy documents, Hill was comfortable enough to make the Capitol rounds again, and identifiable enough to be ambushed by TMZ outside his hotel. People always have these different conspiracy theories, the cameraman reminded him, in an Olympic feat of Kennedy-splaining. Didn't he ever wonder? Never, Hill said. I was there. Roberta Flack, born 1937. She dreamed of being a classical pianist, but made pop history instead, by Bob Horberger. The piano, she remembered, didn't smell very good. Her father had rescued it from a junkyard, and a distinct odor lingered, left by what she imagined to be little rat-tiny people that once lived inside. Still, it was the piano her family could afford, and she took to it immediately. The beauty of a Chopin prelude or a Mozart sonata overcoming the smell and any other rigors of regular practice. By the time Roberta Flack was in high school in Arlington, Virginia, she had grown so proficient that she was voted most musical, and classmates predicted she would make it to Carnegie Hall. I was very popular, she said, because I could play anything. She graduated at 15 and won a scholarship to Howard University, where she dreamed of becoming a professional classic pianist. Not the easiest pursuit, especially given the headwinds of racism and sexism. But the music community at Howard was rich. The future R&B great Donny Hathaway would meet her there later, among others. And at least one black woman, the opera singer Leontine Price, had risen to the top of the classical field in the 1950s. Why couldn't Flack, with her talent, be next? But those headwinds proved too strong, and she realized that the prospects for a classical career weren't very promising. The idea in my mind was always to do something musical. It was not necessarily, if I can't be a concert pianist, I'm going to quit, she told NPR in 1989. I mean, after you practice all those years and all those hours, you must find a light of some kind. She got a degree in music education, sometimes teaching Bach chorales to kids who ran in from tobacco fields to rehearse with her. The concert artiste alter ego she imagined. Rubina Flake was never far away, waiting for her chance to emerge. It would take almost a decade, but she figured out a strategy applying classical leanings to other types of music. There were club dates, and in 1969 an album, First Take, the blueprint for an entire career. It had a compelling mixology of classical, jazz, gospel, folk, and blues, as well as lyrics about civil rights, gay men, who were among her early supporters, justice, all presented in plain-spoken, slowly unspooling style. The jazz musician Les McCann, who helped discover Flack, wrote in the album's liner notes that she carried the listener beyond every barrier as though it never existed. The larger public wasn't quite ready for her. The top 40 was still mostly the province of car radio, caffeine, and not Flack's brand of slow drip testimonies. But one listener with more patient ears was Clint Eastwood, who 2 years later put Flack's version of The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face in the movie Play Misty for Me, an old folk song turned into a 5-minute plus meditation on erotic bliss. It played in its entirety with no dialogue, something clicked. It became a huge hit. But it was only a warm-up for her magnum opus, Killing Me Softly with his song, another long piece of musical mesmerism. Even if you didn't recognize the classical touches, these records made you feel smarter. And of course, there were her trademark deep steeps of emotion. Fans would come up to her and say, "Yeah, that's my life," she recalled in a radio interview. Now, the 36-year-old former schoolteacher was the premier female vocalist in pop music in an era that included Diana Ross and Aretha Franklin. There were Grammys and an apartment in the Dakota where she lived next door to John Lennon and Yoko Ono, with the jazzy, spritzy Feel Like Making Love in 1974. She became the first solo female artist of the rock era to land #1 pop hits in 3 consecutive years. All of a sudden, you get the rush of 20,000, 30,000, 50,000 people. The world, she told Time in 1975. All these people love me, you think. Then you're back in a hotel room by yourself in Missouri. Your stomach hurts and your humanness just overwhelms you. As her stature grew, the headwinds picked up again. Some critics started to suggest that her sound was a little too easy on the ears, maybe a little too white. One of the hassles of being a black female musician, she said in 1975, is that people are always backing you into a corner and telling you to sing soul. I'm a serious artist. I feel a kinship with people like Arthur Rubinstein and Glenn Gould. If I can't play Bartok when I want to play Bartok, then nothing else matters, she added. It doesn't make me very popular in certain communities. She continued to defy trends and critics. In 1978, at the height of disco fever, she released a luxurious ballad, The Closer I Get to You, a duet with Hathaway. It sold 1 million copies. A few years later, she put out maybe her most placid single, Making Love, the theme song from one of the first mainstream movies about a gay romance. The lyrics were general, but this was the 1980s, when just being associated with the movie posed a risk. I could never be afraid to sing a song about love, whether between a man and woman, 2 men or 2 women, she said. The song made the top 10. Flack was still giving concerts in her 80s until AIS forced her to stop singing in 2022. She did make it to Carnegie Hall 16 times. In fact, while she may never have played a program of her beloved Chopin or Bartok there, she did perform works by other master composers, the likes of Stevie Wonder, Carole King, Lennon, and McCartney. And with pieces like Killing Me Softly and Feel Like Making Love, there was no shortage of classics for her to play. Her own. Terence Stamp, born 1938. He left acting for an ashram and returned to the screen transformed by Anthony Giardino. In 1969, after filming The Mind of Mr. Soames, his 10th film in a decade, during which he had been, according to one critic, the seductive dark prince of British cinema, Terence Stamp, then 31, came to the realization that his career was over. A certain enigmatic quality, coupled with extraordinary beauty, had made him the epitome of cool in his era. His highly publicized affair with the British model Jean Shrimpton didn't hurt. He had worked with major directors, including William Wyler and Federico Fellini, but suddenly the film offers had dried up. Looking back at that moment 45 years later, he told Charlie Rose, "I was so identified with the 60s, but when the 60s ended, I kind of ended with it." You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the December 28th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. His reaction to perceived rejection was abrupt and decisive. As he described it in his 2017 memoir, "The ocean fell into the drop. Carefully packed my weekend Gucci hold-all and set off. First stop, Delhi. Lots of celebrities at the time were making that pilgrimage, but Stamp's sojourn turned into something else entirely. An 8-year retreat prompted as much by a life-changing lunch with the Indian sage Krishnamurti as by his career decline." What Krishnamurti tapped into was Stamp's loss of contentment with the outer trappings of success. In India, Stamp found himself drawn to the phenomenon of breath and became obsessed with studying it. His immersion went deep enough that he eventually took on a new name, Swami Deva Vritan, and moved into an ashram. But as serious as his Suli practice became, the ambitious East End boy was always convinced that the call back to the movies would come, and he wanted to be prepared. Studying Sufi breathing, he seemed never to have forgotten the practical advice Laurence Olivier gave him at the start of his career. "Always work on your voice, Terence, as when your looks fade, the voice continues to be empowered." The call finally did come in 1978 in the form of a telegram from his agent inviting him to London to appear as General Zod in Superman and Superman 2. One of the legends that Stamp liked to spread about himself had him boarding a plane, still in his ashram clothes, and being approached on the set by his perplexed co-star Marlon Brando. He must have known how hard that story would be to accept, coming from a man who included the Gucci hold-all in his quest narrative, and who insisted that his conversations with Krishnamurti He must have known how hard that story would be to accept, coming from a man who included the Gucci hold-all in his quest narrative, and who insisted that his conversations with Krishnamurti invariably began with a current discussion of the price of bespoke shoes. He amended the story to one in which he met Brando, his boyhood idol, accompanied by 2 young women whom Brando immediately offered to share. Whatever the truth of Stamp's arrival on set, his performance of General Zod led to a remarkable second act. He had become a different actor. No trace of the Cockney was left, his voice having taken on an impressive authority. All that breath work had paid off. His time away had transformed him, making it easier to accept supporting actor status. It was inevitable, though, that he would get back to playing leads. His role as a trans woman in The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, came first, in 1994, but it was Steven Soderbergh's The Limey in 1999 that amounted to Stamp's true restoration. In that film, he plays a man named Wilson, recently released from a British prison, headed to Los Angeles to avenge the murder of his daughter. Gone is the Etonian grace that Stamp's voice had affected in all those 80s and 90s supporting roles. Wilson would speak as my own father had, he wrote in his memoir. The entire performance can be seen as a homage to that father, a coal stoker on merchant ships in World War II, a silent man who never offered his son a word of encouragement, but whom Stamp came to admire for having supported 5 children on 12 pounds a week. Harking back by way of his father to his own rough beginnings, embracing the self-described East End spiv, he had work to distance himself from, seemed to free him as an actor. For long passages, the film becomes a study of Stamp's aging face in troubled repose. Of all his roles, it's the one where he seems most completely there. The Limey did not, alas, lead to a string of great leading roles, but perhaps it offered Stamp the opportunity for a deeper reckoning with an early career that had been cut short. The wonderful conceit of Soderbergh's film was to use as backstory for the aging Wilson clips from Stamp's performance in 1967's Poor Cow, his loosest, most appealing early role. When an interviewer asked him, after a screening of the film, where the guy who played the young Wilson was, Stamp caught himself feeling nostalgic for my own 25-year-old physique. But then he responded, he had his 15 minutes of fame. I haven't heard from him lately. Kanzi, born 1980, The Bonobo Who Has a Lot to Say, by Malia Wolin. Nearly everything about Kanzi's life was manipulated by humans, including his conception. Handlers at Emory University in Atlanta handpicked his bonobo parents. He was born inside a man-made enclosure on October 28, 1980, and soon after was snatched from his birth mother by another female bonobo named Matata, whom researchers had been trying to teach language. His birth mother went back to a zoo, but baby Kanzi tagged along with his adopted mother to the Language Research Center at Georgia State University. There he clambered on furniture and stole treats, while scientists trained Matata to recognize objects like a banana or a peanut and point to the corresponding symbol on a lexigram keyboard. At the time, a fierce debate was raging in the fields of linguistics and psychology. Could an ape learn language, or did only humans have that capacity? Matata, for her part, wasn't showing much promise. Then one day, when she was elsewhere, Kanzi began using the symbols, despite having received no training. He made an expression that primate researchers call a play face, touched apple and chase, and then picked up an apple and ran away. He used the lexigrams 120 times that first day. The researchers were shocked. Had this lanky little bonobo with the large eyes acquired language through social exposure, much as a human child would? Scientists had long believed that apes lacked the neural control over their vocal tract muscles required to speak. So in the 1960s, researchers began training apes in a variety of nonverbal linguistic systems, including American Sign Language. A chimp named Washoe was taken home and taught ASI signs by married psychology professors. Later, Coco the gorilla and Chantek the orangutan learned signs too. Other apes communicated using tokens and symbols on a lexigram board, but the notion that a non-human species could ever grow grammar was controversial. The linguist Noam Chomsky famously said, "It's about as likely that an ape will prove to have language ability as that there is an island somewhere with a species of flightless birds waiting for human beings to teach them to fly." That kind of skepticism angered some researchers who harbored a dream that they would one day take these linguistic apes back to their native habitats, where the animals would translate between their wild counterparts and humans. It was a very 1970s vision, one shared by a psychologist named Herbert S. Terrace, who set out to prove that apes could, in fact, learn language. His team worked with a chimp called Nim Chimpsky, a jab at their chief intellectual adversary. But after reviewing hundreds of hours of videotape of the chimp signing, Terrace published a study in Science concluding that the chimp wasn't using words but let alone syntax. Nim was essentially just begging. The paper put a damper on talking ape research. Back to Georgia, though, Kanzi and a psychologist and primatologist named Sue Savage Rumbaugh pressed on with the lexigram symbols. Together they roamed 55 acres of wooded property surrounding the center with a printed lexigram board in tow. Increasingly, Kanzi seemed to exhibit an ability to understand spoken English. When he was 4, Kanzi was featured on the front page of the New York Times in an article titled "Pygmy Chimp Readily Learns Language Skill." At 8, he spent months in a head-to-head contest with a 2-year-old girl in which Savage Rumbaugh gave them 660 novel sentences, including "Put the toothbrush in the lemonade." Kanzi completed the request 72% of the time, more than his toddler rival. But questions were inevitable. What was he actually capable of? Were Kanzi's communication skills language or something else? Perhaps it was all what behavioral researchers call the Cleaver-Hans effect, named for a famous horse in early 20th century Germany who appeared to be doing arithmetic when quizzed, but turned out to be responding to some nearly imperceptible clues, like changes in breathing, from his questioners. By the time the millennium turned over, scientists' interest in the question of whether apes were capable of language had waned. Even as talking animals moved back into the realm of myth and fable, Kanzi kept his place in the culture. He played music with Paul McCartney and Peter Gabriel, who later called the cross-species jam session one of the most remarkable experiences of his life. He was featured on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and Anderson Cooper paid him a visit dressed in a bunny suit. Kanzi lived out his days in a 230-acre bonobo sanctuary in Des Moines, funded for a while by a meatpacking magnate. At the start, Kanzi and the bonobos are groomed and sometimes slept alongside the researchers in what the humans called a hybrid pan-homo culture. Pan for paniscus, the Latin name for bonobos, and homo for Homo sapiens. But communes are notoriously difficult to sustain even when all of their members share a mother tongue. Eventually, the humans were told they could no longer enter the bonobos' enclosure. Still, through plexiglass, a YouTube influencer taught Kanzi to play Minecraft. The actor Jesse Eisenberg screened a movie for him in which Eisenberg plays a Sasquatch. Right up to his death, the last of the talking apes was bright-eyed, empathic creature, inclined to contact with other apes, including us humans with our lofty ideas and our odd requests. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from the December 28th issue of the New York Times Magazine. Your reader has been Evelyn. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the USA Today. Following that at 2 o'clock, with episode number 3 of Mark Twain by Ron Chernow. Stay with us for these readings and more.
Service now presents a reading of articles